as you arrive. Thanks for joining us for this, what is a slightly experimental event, looking to examine and break down silos where people working across disciplines and trying to improve understanding of other types of knowledge and other ways of working in relation to ocean governance. So first of all, before I introduce myself and my panelists and give you a brief overview of the session, I'll just go through a bit of housekeeping. So first of all, if you could all introduce yourselves in the chat, please feel free. We're really interested to hear where you're coming from, what you're working on, and why you're interested in joining us. Also, if you have any questions, if you could please use the Q&A function, and then if you just post the name of the person that you're directing the specific question to, that would be helpful. Also, feel free to just sort of answer questions or explore any topics more deeply in the chat. This session is being recorded, and this will include comments and questions. So if you don't want to be included in this, then please contact us by email immediately after the event has finished. Whilst we'll endeavour to answer all of your questions within the session, just to recognise them, this is quite short and there may not be enough time, but please feel free to contact us directly via the One Ocean Hub website or by email, or by repeating the question in the post-event survey. So I guess that's enough housekeeping. Again, and in case some of you weren't there and weren't with us at the very beginning, this is going to be a slightly experimental event, and we've got lots of things going on, and our speakers are sort of primed and ready for some sort of surprise questions or surprise topics that I haven't provided them, so we'll see how that goes. I'm Holly Niner. I'm a research fellow at the University of Plymouth, working on various aspects of the project across many disciplines, and I'm part of the One Ocean Hub project, which is actually where me and my fellow discussants have met, or through the hub. So the One Ocean Hub is a community of scholars from 22 international universities, research centres from the UK, South Africa, Ghana, Namibia, Kenya, South Pacific and the Caribbean. And we have over 30 project partners, including UN agencies, NGOs, media representatives and government departments. And the vision for the One Ocean Hub is for integrated ocean governance, for equitable and inclusive sustainability, facilitated by effective communication and mutual understanding across disciplines. And the aim is the idea that we create knowledge where we don't need to translate one discipline into the terms of another discipline, because there is the risk that things might be lost in translation. So within the principles of our research within the hub, one of the strong principles that comes through is that we are all meant to be working or researching and developing knowledge on a transdisciplinary platform. But that said, working in a transdisciplinary format is challenging, and I think all of us have been part of some confusing discussions and interactions, which we felt very much come from the fact that it's very difficult not to be entrenched in your own silo of knowledge or your own silo of your discipline. And this is where the idea for this session was born, as a way to start to overcome this, to bring us together in a location to just explore some of the reasons that barriers exist and how we can start understanding each other a bit better. And we thought this would be best done through a dialogue. So again, I will highlight that this is a bit of an experimental approach. So we're really happy that you're joining us for this, and please, feel free to get involved through the chat or otherwise. So I'll now introduce our presenters and discussants. I've asked them to give me a slide with an image or information to illustrate who they are, their background and their interests. So I'll move around our panelists. And so panelists, be ready when you see your image and pop up. You have 30 seconds to introduce yourself and some of your interests. So let me share my screen and do this. And So over to Otto, I believe.
Hello, everyone. My name is Otto Whitehead, and I'm an ecologist and filmmaker from Cape Town, South Africa. And I'm currently doing a postdoc with Professor Kerry Sink at the South African National Biodiversity Institute and Nelson Mandela University. And I'm also part of the One Ocean Hub. My interests lie in using film to promote empathy for ecosystems, and particularly in the realm of decision making. And Mzansi, what you see here, was a project with Kerry Sink, and that involved building a website for South Africa's marine protected areas and creating a film to show the benefits of marine protected areas and to help advance marine protection in South Africa. Cool, that's me.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rose Boswell. I'm an anthropologist and a poet. And my work is here at Nelson Mandela University. I'm a professor of ocean cultures and heritage. I'm also part of the One Ocean Hub, specifically in its work on intangible cultural heritage. And the image that you see here is of a woman that I met while I was doing field research in Zanzibar a good few years ago. She's a seaweed farmer. And what is fascinating to me about this image is the way in which women who are often perceived as vulnerable groups and who are often members of vulnerable groups, how they have taken their livelihood into their own hands and how they continue to express a great deal of resilience and inventiveness despite their challenges. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
My screen is playing tricks on me. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alana. I'm from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus in Barbados. I'm an energy and environmental lawyer, and I specialize in the marine environment. My interests are in international and regional comparative law in these areas of specialty, and adding to the body of research in the Caribbean region.
Hi everybody, my name is John Windy Ansa from the University of Cape Coast, Ghana. I am a senior lecturer in political economy. I teach political sociology and political economy. And I'm a member of this hub, of the One Ocean Hub, and I come into this research with, by looking at the intersections between transformative justice and then political decisions, you know. In other words, how political decisions can work to promote transformative justice. So I come into this research focusing on RP5, which deals with the intangibles and tangibles of the oceans. And then I also I'm also interested in the critical perspective of the blue economy, you know. So I come in here by looking at some of the intersections between the economy and politics, how political decisions are affecting the economic activities relative to the ocean, and then how some, you know, external issues like foreign engagement, and then some, you know, macroeconomic policies like neoliberalism and then statism are working together to either promote or create platforms for exploitations, you know, or corporations and competitions among the actors in the fishing industry. So the picture you see over here is the study site, that is Elmina. And Elmina is a hodgepodge of fishing activities. All the 5, you know, elements of fishing activities can be found over there. All the issues we are trying to explore, particularly with regard to the tangibles and intangibles and the critical perspectives, can be looked at within the study site. In other words, this study site can serve as a platform where all the pieces of information needed to at least bring out some of the critical issues as far as ocean governance is concerned, can be found. So this is a place which is my study site. And of course, I'm expecting that we'll be having an exciting moment as we do the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Hello, everybody. This is my picture. My name is Nicole Franz. I'm working at the FAO, that's the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. I'm a fishery planning officer, even though I'm trained as an economist. And I work mostly on small-scale fisheries policy. The reason why I've chosen this particular picture is that what you see here is a Roman mosaic. And given that I've spent over half of my life in Rome now, I'm based here, I've chosen that. I've also chosen it because it's a piece of art, which I admire for the beauty, but also for stimulating the thinking and as a vehicle of communication. And the communication that is coming from this particular piece of mosaic here is that small-scale fisheries has already been an important back when this mosaic was produced, and that was back in the 4th century. And I think it's a really important legacy to maintain this form of livelihood. Also, we're going to talk today and in other forums around the sustainable oceans governance to make sure that this form of activities is included in all the discussions around sustainable ocean governance in the future. Thank you.
Greetings from Fiji, everybody. My name is Payal Maharaj. I am from the University of the South Pacific, and I work as a project officer for the One Ocean Hub. I work primarily on the Transdisciplinary project, looking at policies. My background is of virology and climate change. So I think both of these merge together in a way which is mutually important to make policies. And I see a lot of benefits in having different disciplines merge together. So thank you very much. And I welcome all of you.
Hi everyone, my name is David Wilson. I am a lecturer and maritime historian from the University of Strathclyde. My research interests focus on the maritime dimensions of empire. My work in the past has focused on the history of piracy and its role in the extension of state authority over the sea. For One Ocean Hub, my research focuses on the impact of colonisation on coastal communities and maritime law in Ghana and the Pacific Islands. The image here is Fort Rodney in St. Lucia in the Caribbean, where I dragged my wife on our honeymoon. So never marry an historian is what I meant to show. Thanks.
James.
Yeah, I'm James Bell. I'm a fisheries scientist, deep sea ecologist in the UK. So I'm kind of probably with the more classically end of the natural science spectrum for this topic, but I'm definitely keen to try and find out what everyone else thinks. I mostly work for the government of Tristan da Cunha, which you can see behind me in that picture, and in the South Atlantic. So kind of used to working in remote places, not very much data. That's kind of my sort of background.
There you go. I think, have I left anyone out? I think everyone is happy now. Good. So now, did I escape? Okay, so I'm not showing my screen anymore. Good. So now if I just give a quick overview, because we're running a bit behind. So what we're, the plan for this event is we're going to move through an exercise. We're going to move through an exercise to explore understanding of each other's disciplines, and sort of just explore where there might be some misconceptions and how we have faced these misconceptions in terms of our research and our work towards oceans or within oceans governance. And then we'll finally end up with a presentation from Nicole on transdisciplinary approaches that the FAO have been involved with. But for now, I'll pass over to Payal in Fiji on the topic of transdisciplinarity. Payal, you're on mute, sorry.
Okay. Greetings again, everybody. Sorry for being mute. My name is Payal Maharaj. I'm from the University of the South Pacific. And today I will briefly walk you through the introduction to transdisciplinarity. So, as an outline, I'll briefly go over the definitions, talk a bit about the background, why transdisciplinarity is important, and some of the global approaches. I'll specifically talk about 2 approaches. I'll talk a little bit about a potential Pacific transdisciplinarity approach, and then I will conclude. The word transdisciplinarity or transdisciplinary comes from 2 Latin words. The first word trans means to go across, beyond, or through something. And disciplina is another Latin word which means instruction or training. When you combine these words together, it means that you have a multi-perspective, problem and solution-oriented approach that transcends all boundaries and bridges science with practice. So here I've given you this particular image. I've chosen this because I felt it kind of represents what transdisciplinarity means. So if you look closely at the colors depict certain things. The red colors depict the problems of the world. Then the earth is depicted by the blue colors, the green colors. And you know, there's 2 different kinds of people who are logicians, and the people who are more like social scientists or think differently about the world. You can also take it as religion and sciences merged together and all of the disciplines coming together to solve a particular problem. So that's how I perceive this image to be. And that's what I feel best represents transdisciplinarity. Going through the background, the concept of transdisciplinarity was developed in the 1970s. During the First World Congress on Transdisciplinarity in 1994, they emphasized that transdisciplinarity is contrary to reductionism. It is complementary to a disciplinary approach. The understanding of reality as something multi-referential. It does not mean that you should have one view. You can have multi-perspectives of that. Accepting of values and favorable to dialogue. So in transdisciplinarity approach, we favor communication and open communication. Of course, being respectful of differences. Then understanding that the economy must serve human beings and approving of scientific research being guided by rigor, tolerance, and openness. These are some of the background which I feel is necessary to highlight what transdisciplinary is all about. And then why do we need it? Why do we talk about transdisciplinarity? It is because we want to tackle real life problems, address the complexity of these problems by involving a variety of actors from science and practice and accounting for the diversity of their perspectives, and to create knowledge that is solution-oriented, socially robust, and transferable to both scientific and societal practice. So something which makes sense to the real world. And the whole aim of transdisciplinarity is the comprehension of the present world, which one of its imperatives being the unity of knowledge in its diversity. So one thing particular which I have also noticed is that, you know, sometimes, as Holly mentioned in the beginning, that we sometimes are in silos. Different disciplines are working in their own silos. And we want to have unity so that we can benefit from whatever discipline it is out there. So if you look at the current world problems, you can see that ocean acidification is a huge concern. There's forest fires, there's drought, there's extreme climatic events, and then the problem of pollution in various forms. I've taken few of these, and then I feel that transdisciplinarity is meant to solve these complex problems, which does not have one area, one has to deal with. It has to come from policies to the ground, to the people, to the government, to every aspect. So I feel transdisciplinarity addresses this well. Now, the major differences between interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and multidisciplinarity, I'll go one by one. So in multidisciplinarity, I'll take an example of, for example, doing a surgery. During a surgery of maybe separating conjoined twins, you can see that, a cardiologist, a person who gives anesthesia, the surgeons, or the nurses, they all do not change their disciplines, but they come together to solve a complex problem. So that, I feel, is a perfect example of a multidisciplinarity scenario. Moving on to interdisciplinarity, here, the best example which I could think about is conservation projects, which starts from for example, here in the Pacific, we have ridge to reef conservation efforts. So here we do not necessarily change the disciplines as well, but we come together to formulate a different thing. For example, if you want to do conservation, you have to start from the land, then the ocean, kind of like using attributes of both, and then finding a new kind of discipline, which can be in the form of conservation, and that will be the problem solution. However, in transdisciplinarity, the new thing which comes over here is that a new field of practice is made. For example, if you look at the One Ocean Hub, we have lawyers, we have policymakers, we have scientists, students, all people, community members even. So what happens over here is that we all come together, we communicate, and first of all, we do not know how to solve the problem, but we come together, and then we kind of form a new field of practice, something which works for everybody, and that is used to solve a complex problem. So moving on, two of the global approaches which I will highlight in my talk is a knowledge integration approach. This leads to generation of new knowledge for the designing of future processes by supporting reflective and adaptive sessions. So a lot of thinking goes on here. And the knowledge integration is influenced by the objectives to be achieved. So whoever is in the room, it is influenced by the participants involved in the process. And it is also, the research questions to be answered is also important to be considered during the knowledge integration approach. So over here, I'll give you an example. This is, we had a workshop at the University of the South Pacific, and we have a stakeholder workshop where a variety of people came together. They worked, in a group and individually, and then they talked about many of the things, and they gave out whatever they felt was important, and that gave a lot of perspective to us. Another global approach used for transdisciplinarity is holistic approach. This holistic approach, it offers a vision of the world and life as completed as possible, and has a starting point with human nature, with all its complexity and diverse forms of manifestation. So the holistic approach of the real world is very interactive and extremely complex. So it cuts across different disciplines, and inside the discipline goes beyond it. So if you look at this particular image, you'll see the iceberg. So sometimes we only focus on the visible part of the iceberg, not recognizing that there's a whole chunk of invisible portion. So in a holistic approach, we look at the invisible and the visible portion of the iceberg, and we deal with the problem in that way. Now, potential Pacific transdisciplinary approach. Here in the Pacific, we talk about relational hermeneutics, which could potentially be the founding principles to developing a transdisciplinary methodology or approach for the Pacific region. The relationality encourages a cosmocentric rather than an anthropocentric view. So mostly looking at things from a holistic view rather than just from our own perspective, and also including nature in that. So the Pacific relationality embraces those connections, driving the belief that we are the ocean rather than we have the ocean. So we are thinking ourselves as being part of the nature rather than being a separate entity from it. And this beautiful image is taken from the Pacific. It is known for its beautiful beach, the nature and lovely flowers and lovely people. So this particular concept is under consideration. As a concluding word, I would like to say that transdisciplinarity needs to have a social and cultural context where it is applied, and not just a technical processes of merging sectors. Another thing is that transdisciplinarity will manifest itself in different ways in different places due to contextual differences. I haven't included it here, but if you're thinking who can be part of this transdisciplinary process, anybody who is interested can be part of it. And with that, I conclude my talk. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Payal, for that. We're running a little bit behind now, so I might suggest that we, if you have any questions or reflections, if you could all post them in the Q&A, and then we can get back to them as we move on, because hopefully we'll be exploring some of these topics within the following the discussion that's coming. So just to explain what we're doing next, it's a bit fun and I'm a little bit nervous about it, but in a way to explore this, we thought it would be interesting to explore how we view our colleagues that are here present on the panel, view what they do, how they approach the problem that we're all working towards, which conceptually is the sustainable and equitable and just oceans governance, and how each other approach that problem, and how they will go about developing knowledge and integrating knowledge. So what I've done is I've asked all of the panel members to submit their best guess and perhaps play devil's advocate in their second guess as to what each other does. So the question that I posed was, consider X discipline. So for example, an economist, I said, how do you think that they would approach the problem of achieving sustainable oceans governance? So as an example, in relation to what I often refer to myself as is a boundary spanner, with a specialism in marine governance. The reply I got was, never heard of it. I don't know what it is. Maybe this is an impossible job. And so it's interesting for me to consider, well, perhaps this label that I apply to myself that I think is very clever and really neatly captures how useful I am, is actually really unhelpful in opening up sort of, or making myself accessible for other people, and seeing opportunities that we could work together, and for me to sort of not only integrate myself, but sort of be part of the problem solving or the problem definition sort of process. So anyway, enough about me. The plan for the rest of this presentation or event is for me to present some of these definitions that we've had, and so we can explore together, each within our own discipline, to explore how these definitions represent real life, actually what these people do, and also their experiences of whether these misconceptions have presented barriers to transdisciplinarity or the integration or the uptake of their discipline and knowledge. So we're also going to intersperse this with some videos, some people that are unable to be with us today, and also represent disciplines that we don't have on the panel. So to start this, we're going to start off with a video from Stuart Lang, a natural resource economist at the James Michel Blue Economy Research Institute in the Seychelles, at the University of Seychelles. So Stuart will introduce himself, I expect, but he's worked on projects valuing coral reef ecosystem services, and also investigated the introduction of environmental levies on tourists, among various other things. So we're going to play this video, and then I'll share with you the description that I've received from others here, and we can perhaps get a few reflections from the panel on the description versus what Stuart presents in his video. So James, if you don't mind sharing that video.
The role of economists is important as they consider the use of scarce resources and understand that in using resources, there are trade-offs that need to be made. Economists want to find the level of resource use that delivers optimal economic yields instead of pure maximum yields. More than 80% of international trade uses the ocean. Economics helps us to understand how fundamental oceans are to our livelihoods. Economists can help guide leaders and policymakers to make better informed decisions on how to utilize the natural resources associated with the ocean, and that there are trade-offs and opportunity costs associated with every choice that will have ramifications on the lives of others in other countries and the well-being of future generations. Economists do not have the best reputation for considering the long term. As John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we are all dead. However, as societies embrace more vehemently intergenerational thinking and the fundamental importance of natural resources, this will help guide leaders to think less about short-term profits and more about long-term investments. So how does my role as an economist contribute towards sustainable ocean governance? Well, firstly, we have to have an understanding of how society and decision makers function. Headlines and media regularly contain financial figures in them, and money is a universal means in which we convey value. But when considering natural resources, the financial value that is estimated or reported upon is seldom accurate. However, this is far better than not providing a value. Ascribing values to natural resources helps governments, private sector, and managers to get an understanding of the importance of the natural resources. Scientists need to communicate with economists to help them understand the interconnected systems and how the exploitation of one resource can have knock-on effects across systems and across geographical boundaries. This is particularly important in the ocean space where there are no borders and so many resources are common pool or open access, free to roam into adjacent territories. Valuations have improved over the last 30 years, with more interdisciplinary work seeing more attempts at valuing nature, from species to ecosystems to biodiversity.
Great, thank you. So now I'll just share my screen here, and we can look at one of the brief descriptions that I've been given. So I'll keep my screen on share until we have our next video. So here's one of the definitions. So economists assess how new systems will improve and expand on the current economic system, making sure that projects are economically viable. So that's interesting. I don't know if anyone there has any reflections, perhaps Nicole, I know you have some economic expertise in terms of how you think this definition actually, whether that represents perhaps what Stuart has just said, or the role.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Holly. Let me maybe kick off with sharing some thoughts here. And thanks for doing this. It's a quite different format, so can be fun. Let's see what comes out of it. I think the description given here, yeah, it is in a way reflecting what many people probably think about how economists look in particular also the ocean economy, that the focus is really on the projects, on economic viability, and that's also something that came through very strongly from the presentation or from the video that we just saw, that economists really try to capture the value of the oceans, of natural resources by transforming that value into monetary figures. And I think that is something that is quite common, how the role of economists is perceived. What was also said in the video is that obviously has some limitations, because if we only look at the monetary terms, we're missing out on some of the other values that define our societies, and where it's more difficult to put the dollar sign on it, the cultural values that the oceans may have. And we just heard the presentation from the Pacific, and the ocean plays a big role there. So how do we capture the values? And what is the risk if we only take the economic value, where then, for example, an investment in expanding the tourism industry would always fare much better, rather than supporting a local fishing community that is tied to the ocean through some values that are not necessarily so easy to put into these figures. Because I think you may all know the saying that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So I think this is something that applies here. And I think, there are many streams in economics that are facing that dilemma, and they're trying to find ways out.
I did have, sorry if I can jump in, I also had
Go ahead.
another reflection within this exercise where somebody stated that economists are unlikely to be open to qualitative analyses or non-use benefit approaches or benefits of approaches to oceans governance. I don't know if you had any reflections on that point.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, that is something where we have the path dependency, I guess, all from our disciplines. And this is where that is certainly one of those barriers. And this is also, I think, where what is happening now, what we can see in terms of the evolution of valuing ecosystems, where concepts are used like the non-use value of nature, which in a way is a way to put a dollar sign and a quantitative value even on something like non-uses or non-tangible uses. I think what is also interesting in the presentation by Stuart is that at the end that he is calling for this collaboration between scientists in terms of environmentalists, the way I've seen it, because he was mentioning biodiversity, looking at that pillar of sustainability, so that, say, economists and scientists in terms of environmental scientists should work more together. But he did not at all refer to social scientists. And I think, that is still quite of a barrier to overcome, to also see how that third pillar of social sustainability can really come into that.
That's certainly interesting. I will say Stuart did sort of do that recording on the fly, so I don't want to sort of sort of say that he is the sort of or that he feels that he's defines economists everywhere, but I just want to thank him for sending that video in. That's very helpful. I'll also highlight to my fellow panelists, if you want to jump in, can I ask you to do so, because I can't see the chat function while I'm sharing my screen. So now we'll move on, thanks Nicole, to, if I can move my, oh no, here we are, to fisheries scientists. So this is James here. So if you have a look here, James, we have some descriptions of a fisheries scientist. So the people who tell us how much fish we can have this year.
I like that. Unfortunately, it's more like the people who tell us how much fish we should have this year, and then the politicians tell you how much you can have. It's not always the same number, unfortunately. I think in a weird way, like this fisheries science discipline is actually probably more similar to economics than you might think. People probably think of us as being people who are obsessed with looking in fish's guts and stuff like that, and we do that. I do that, but it's more about managing fisheries rather than fish. So in a sense, fisheries science is more about human behavior than it is about fish, because in effect we can't really manage the fish. All we can do is manage how much fishing or how much kind of pressure we put on those fish, which is how you get to the question of how much fish can you have each year. So I mean, essentially the way we think about these sort of systems is to sort of compartmentalize everything. So you have sort of a box, which is your stock size. So you can imagine that like your bank account, and then you've got income and you've got expenditure. So it's very similar to kind of flow of money, except what we're talking about is flow of fish protein. So yeah, I mean, there's a kind of whole sort of spectrum of it, from people who are sort of much more focused on understanding the life history of fish, so understanding how their relationship between size and age, versus all the way through to people who actually don't really know anything about fish. I work with one person who is afraid of fish, but she's a brilliant stock assessment scientist. So yeah, there's a big kind of spectrum of it, but yeah, it's more about human behavior than fish, than perhaps you might think.
And James, and do you think that it's a fair criticism that you're perhaps unlikely to receive qualitative or perceive qualitative research on fisheries as valid or useful?
Yeah, probably, yeah. I mean, in terms of the kind of history of fisheries science, is a very strong focus on kind of quantitative, at least conceptual models, understanding of how a stock or a system works. I think, you know, we are increasingly trying to sort of break down and certain things when you're trying to think about what someone's motivation to fish and how that affects how they will behave. So if you're fishing to get to eat, or as opposed to fishing for profit, if you're fishing to eat, you will keep fishing for as long as you can until there are no fish left. If you're fishing for profit, you'll stop. So yeah, there's kind of, I think it's becoming more and more sort of that people are aware of it, but yeah, historically it's definitely a sort of tons in, tons out sort of idea.
So thanks, James. So I've just stopped sharing. So if you could play our second video. So our second video is from Daniela and Lena. Well, she'll introduce herself, and we'll just watch this video and see what reflect.
As a human and scientist, I am interested in learning from various fronts: ecology, conservation, geography, anthropology, photography, documentary. My name is Daniela Laínez El Pozo. I am a social ecologist from Peru, and I am currently researching the challenges that we have to make marine protected areas effective for biodiversity conservation and equitable to the local people. I listen to the views of different actors: those who bear the direct consequences of marine degradation, like small-scale fishers and local communities, and also the voices of scientists, government, and industrial sectors that drive political decisions. I analyze these perspectives in their ecological, historical, socio-political, economic, and cultural contexts. This analysis contributes to understand the limitations of our governance structures and processes, and allows us to propose integral and realistic routes towards achieving sustainable ocean governance.
Thanks, Daniela. So now I'll hop back to sharing my screen. And that was a really, really lovely video we had there describing Daniela's position, which perhaps we might think of that actually, she's sort of a transdisciplinary individual where she's got a lot of knowledge and expertise embodied within a single person. And I think there are a few of us perhaps working not with identical experiences or knowledges, but working in that capacity in the hub. So in relation to both an ecologist and a deep sea ecologist, and I think this is perhaps very different to a social ecologist, it was quite interesting to me to see that for an ecologist, people responded with, they would map out an ecosystem and determine the links between organisms, including humans. And this process helps determine areas that need attention or interventions to promote ecosystem resilience. So that was quite interesting to me, that someone had suggested that an ecologist would consider humans, because I think in my perspective, I think of an ecologist as someone who really separates humans out from the other parts of the natural world. And I don't know if any of our panelists here have anything to comment on Daniela's video, or perhaps these descriptions here.
Yeah, if I may comment, Holly, I thought it was a very powerful video, and what was striking to me was the range and the scale of the work that she was doing. The fact that she was engaging with, you know, the local community members, the fishing folk, and people who are directly involved, you know, in eking out, you know, a living, you know, from the sea, all the way to, you know, policymakers and those involved in oceans governance. I thought that was really powerful for me. And I think maybe if we look at the first definition that is offered on the slide, it does capture that, because the word ecologist is prefaced by the word social. So in a way, it gives us a sense of what the priority, you know, is for that particular individual embedded in that discipline. And I thought that was the most amazing, you know, work that I've seen, especially with, you know, I never imagined that, you know, when, you know, speaking about ecologists, that a person would do that range of work.
Yeah, I'd agree. It was very nice. And I thought by contrast here, we've got a description, and perhaps James might agree or disagree, that deep sea ecologists perhaps don't have such a close relationship with people.
I certainly agree with the geek out on strange creatures bit. That was basically my PhD. But they don't really matter to people. Well, I mean, yeah, it goes, you know, that point's fair to the extent that people kind of, the things that matter to people are the things they know. But in terms of saying that it doesn't matter to people, I mean, just one example that comes off the top of my head is we're increasingly finding that deep sea is actually a brilliant place for drug and pharmaceutical discovery. And the concept of marine genetic resources in terms of issues surrounding human health, it's actually a vastly underappreciated resource, I would say. And then, yeah, there's other things I could list, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. So, Otto, go ahead.
I just wanted to refer back to Daniela's video, and I love the way she said learning from various fronts, and including like ecology and geography and anthropology and documentary and photography. I mean, that really highlights the transdisciplinary approach to her work, and which sounds like a lot of it is listening. And yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on that.
Thank you. So now we'll move on to an anthropologist. So this is just one of the descriptions that we were given. So Rose and I guess perhaps John, this is aimed at you. So it studies human behavior and social systems, maps the ecology of human society, provides information about the perspectives of local communities and indigenous knowledge, a voice for the people that interact with the ocean. So do you have any reflections in relation to that description?
Well, I think it's a beautiful description, actually, especially in relation to the work of anthropologists involved with the oceans. I was expecting something a little bit less favorable because anthropology does have its history, and that history sort of lingers on, especially here in Southern Africa. So I'm really happy to see that definition of anthropology, which is actually also mindful of the scale of, you know, at which we work, that we don't just, you know, work in isolated communities that are perceived to be objectively exotic, but that we engage with people from all walks of life, and that we seek to communicate this knowledge to a wider audience. I think maybe what what is perhaps missing from the definition is the fact that we do also do research that Laura Nader, who's an anthropologist way back in the 1970s, calls sort of top down, research. So we don't just work with people who are perceived to be vulnerable and marginal in our communities, but we also work with policymakers. We interview and we do participant observation among those who are objectively perceived to be powerful. Not many people do it, but there are increasing numbers of anthropologists that are doing that kind of work. And that is really interesting and useful because it also helps us to tease out, sort of the discourses that are prevalent in the different social circles. So, a common sort of perception perhaps is that, people who are in the social sciences and perhaps in anthropology who collect qualitative data are not really able to tell us about macro-social and anything about macro-social or macroeconomic trends. But in fact, they can. If they do intergenerational research, if they conduct what are known as life histories, they're able to show us how things have changed over time. And in doing so, are able to clearly map out, whether something is, which we would presume would be within the domain of the marine spatial planners, to what extent have the diversity of fish stocks, for example, been depleted over the course of a person's lifetime. These are certain pieces of information which anthropology could relay that would also take into account, of course, the personal narrative of suffering and resilience that local communities have had to endure.
And John, do you have anything to build on that?
So I think this is a very good description that has been given. It's important. We appreciate how we see the connections between human behavior and social systems. As the social systems exist, we bring out a clear array of social institutions spanning from religion, politics, economics, education, health, the family, and you see that it is not just about the fact that these institutions are just existent, but then there is an interplay between these institutions and how these interplays bring out a set of human behavior, which to a very large extent, as we find now, may either work to sustain social stability or perhaps derail every quest towards social stability. So for an anthropologist to come into the picture, as Rose said, it is not just about societies that are becoming extinct, but then it's also about what a particular society which is perhaps undergoing transformation and how certain pieces of knowledge may be seen to be either existing or perhaps changing, and how these pieces of knowledge can work to either promote, or social stability, or perhaps zero social stability. So when an anthropologist comes into the picture, what anthropologist does is to explore what these, what certain social behaviors, what certain social systems, what certain, indigenous knowledge systems that exist could either be seen as, sustaining social stability or perhaps derailing social stability. So there is this whole notion of being value neutral as far as an anthropologist is concerned. The anthropologist may not necessarily be concerned with what is good or what is bad. The point is exploring what exists and what the outcomes of whatever exists. So the last point that talks about the fact that a voice of the people that interact with the ocean suggests, clearly presents, what we are talking about, because it is not just about what the anthropologist is bringing in, which of course will presuppose some biases. It's about what the people are saying and the direction of their intuitions. But then it is important for us to appreciate that the fact that sometimes we may say that it is always about what the people are saying, and a couple of other things. This is where we need to match existing scientific knowledge with existing indigenous knowledge, and then pitch them against each other and find a common ground. What are the scientists saying about, what maybe would the scientists be saying about, existing fish stock and the scientific processes that are needed to ensure that there is higher fish stock? And what is the indigenous person also saying about the processes needed to ensure a very, very, useful level of fish stock, harvest? So at this point, then it's about making sure the two are merged together to produce a knowledge which can be favorable to both sides of the picture. So sometimes the voices may be there, but they may not be that promotive. They may not be that transformative. It is what the scientists will say that may be critical over here. So I think that, this is a very good description. And then it brings out indeed where the anthropologists would always stand when research is taking place. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks both. So I think some really interesting points there, but we are on a whistle-stop tour of all of the disciplines. So if everyone could hold their thoughts and their comments and questions, and hopefully we will be able to get back to them. But now we're moving on to the lawyer. And so I know Alana was kind of dreading this because she's convinced that everyone just wants to kill her or everyone hates the lawyers. But here we go, the descriptions we have here. And these aren't just the nice ones, these are quite sort of general. Prosecutes people who disobey the laws of the ocean or may disregard local indigenous conceptualizations of the oceans and of rights historically infringed by now legitimate governments and laws. Notions of sovereignty may also be overlooked. So I suppose that's a criticism versus a description.
Okay, I think perhaps beginning with the last description is perhaps the most compelling argument for transdisciplinarity, because one of the things that I think is the perception of law, and in many senses, some areas of lawyers tend to work in silos. And my favorite quote from Shakespeare's King Henry VI is Dick the Butcher saying, the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. I think this perception comes in because of the role of lawyers in addressing, I suppose, the ocean and its resources are assets, really, and often it comes down to the underpinning narrative is apportioning assets, and this is precisely why historically you would have had boundary delimitations or ceding territory to one person or so on. Now that needs to be understood, or one of the things that and I guess too, because my initial background is natural resource management, I perhaps understand it a bit better, but using the law to address ocean and ocean management and natural resource management needs to take into consideration the peculiarities, if we want to say, of the resource. So someone would have alluded, I think it was Scott in the clip, that the ocean is not a nice place you could say X ends here and Y ends there. Most species are highly migratory, and they're also the traditional views and uses and affinities with the ocean. And usually the role of the lawyer is to regulate these, enforce penalties, and penalties usually come, I guess, from prosecution, but there's also the role of the law in monitoring and enforcement. And one of the main areas that we've seen, especially when it comes to marine resources, we've seen the law play a role internationally and even nationally, is basically resolving disputes, successfully or unsuccessfully. That's a whole other scope for discussion. But one of the things I like to posit, because usually when, well, I'm not a practicing lawyer, but usually if you're a practicing lawyer, most clients are interested in what we call the have your day in court approach. And for natural resources, this is not, I submit, this is not necessarily the most effective approach, because this is usually a very adversarial and contentious, in most international courts, we call this the contentious jurisdiction. And unfortunately, we've seen this occur many times. It usually occurs in the form of what we call jurisdictional issues. So maritime delimitations, for example, disputes that go to the Caribbean Court of Justice, sorry, not the Caribbean Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice. So we've had, you've had maritime delimitations in the Caribbean region, for example, between Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados, and between my own country, Guyana and Suriname. And the underpinning narrative, yes, there's a lot of history behind it, but the underpinning narrative is resources of the ocean: oil, gas, fish stocks. We've also had contentious proceedings over living marine species. For example, the ICJ had to adjudicate over whaling in the Antarctic. And these are not necessarily the best approaches. And happily, there are less adversarial approaches such as arbitration and conciliation and mediation, which I think are superior when you want to manage natural resources, because they're more aimed at least parties not trying to come to some common understanding, rather than a winner takes all or a loser goes away kind of approach. One of the most important ways, because I've been talking so far about basically economics versus maybe the environmental approach, but one of the key ways the law can play a positive role is to incorporate or to give the social component of this sustainable equation a larger participatory role, access to information, and also access to justice. And this would be by use of tools such as, health and social environmental impact assessments, the use of the marine spatial planning concept. And I think this this approach is critical because it can center on a more bottom-up approach, incorporate the views of the marginalized, such as women, children, indigenous persons, traditional communities, and so on. And I guess in wrapping up, I will want to say that from my perspective, law is certainly if it's effectively managed ocean and living marine resources of the ocean, can benefit tremendously from a transdisciplinary approach. So I'm quite happy to be, one of the reasons I'm quite happy to be involved in the hobby, because I'm afforded this opportunity.
Good to hear. Thanks, Alana. It's really interesting hearing people's different kind of directions and or sort of angles, I suppose, that they're coming from. So here we have a historian. Funnily enough, no one mentioned any dusty books, David. I know you were expecting that. Yeah. There were pirates in there though, but I chose not to choose and include them here. So here you go. Here are your descriptions.
Thank you. Yeah, it's strange to see there's not any dusty books, but yeah. Yeah, so it's kind of like what a blast from the past, what about the future, and informed by their political leanings. That's interesting. Yeah, so I guess what the question is really addressing is whether we just kind of live in the past as historians, spend all our time in the early modern period and not think about the contemporary period, or, come at it from a very specific political viewpoint, which is interesting. I guess what I would say is that most historians work across multiple different fields of history. So that can be social, cultural, economic, legal, environmental, colonial history. And we do that as a means to try and gain a more holistic and nuanced view of why and how events in the past have occurred and the various impacts of this across time, space, and communities, and how that continues to impact people to this day. I think the political leaning point's interesting because I guess depending on what viewpoint that you are looking at this from, depending on what perspectives, this can be skewed, and it has been skewed in the past, but historians nowadays tend to try to, at least as best as we possibly can, gain a more nuanced view of history by engaging lots of different perspectives. Now, one way to think about this is that, to kind of go back to the dusty old books, given the sources that we use as historians, we kind of need to be constantly aware of the power imbalances and the localized context in which events played out, and try to view these localized concepts not in isolation but also globally. And in doing so, we need to address the power imbalances of the archive themselves. So when we are using written historical sources, we do need to spend a lot of time trying to recognize voices who are not as accessible through written historical archives, and finding ways to try to center their voices, whether through oral histories or engaging with oral traditions of Indigenous peoples or traditional communities. That in the past hasn't really been at the center of historical research. We've tended to use written archives written by very specific people in very specific contexts. So from my perspective, coming from the history of colonialism, we tend to write it. What access we tend to get is from the colonial viewpoint. So to actually get to the people who were colonized, to get to their perspectives, it takes a lot of methodological innovations to try to read against the grain in these sources. And I guess that might be where this political leanings is coming from, is because by reading against the grain, you are recontextualizing that source and therefore recontextualizing that historical event, which if you're of one political leaning may not be looked favourably upon. I would say though that it's necessary to do that and to look at it from all political leanings or no political leanings, to try to view it completely from as unbiased an opinion as you possibly can. But to be honest, when it comes to the history of colonialism, it's difficult to look beyond the violence and look beyond the dispossession to produce anything but a history of that violence. At the same time, I guess one of the most important things we need to do is to balance that out with recognising that violence wasn't just done to people, and that people weren't passively victimised. It's about trying to centre Indigenous agency and Indigenous perspectives within that too. So again, this can be one of the ways that people say that we're taking a specific political leaning because we're trying to really centre Indigenous voices or the voices of, say, the enslaved when it comes to colonial history. But that's necessary to undo the violence of the archives in the past and the violence of history from the past and how it's been written. That was a bit rambly, but hopefully it made sense.
That's great. Thank you, David. Really interesting. So I'll just quickly move on again because we're pushed for time because we're, so diverse. So here, a virologist, Payal. Here we have finding cool medicines from the wonderful weird creatures of the deep, but also you might be compelled to sell these breakthroughs to big pharma rather than working with local communities. Any thoughts?
Thank you, Holly. I feel that, virologists have become very famous these days and people are expecting a lot from them. So as you know that every virus mutates a lot, and the mutations is somehow as a result of whatever environment they are in. So you'll be surprised how much the environment influences the mutations and other like natural products, for example. I'll not talk only about the viruses, but microbes in general or any other species. It mutates, everything kind of like mutates on a cellular level. And then it is all driven by the environment, and that kind of like walks our way back on what products we get. So if you put a lot of if there is a lot of pollutants in the ocean, then obviously there would be bound to be having like more toxins as a byproduct from these microbes. I find this field very interesting, and I've slowly moved from virology to climate change and now to more like policies. So I encourage all of you to seek in this particular field if you are interested. Thank you.
Thanks, Payal. So then we'll move on to a policy advisor. So Nicole, do you have the ear of the powerful? So
let me read this.
Well, something that came through to me is that it was a common sort of feeling that that you needed to know everything, that you needed to have all of the evidence, and you needed to synthesize that, and you need to pass it on. But then that also has risks in terms of, I guess, that the risk of ends justifying the means, because I guess you're having to deal with all of this complex information.
Yeah, I guess that does resonate, certainly, some of it. Yeah, I guess it's the policy advisor is less of a scientist, no? Like when it's more less of a discipline as such. It's more somebody who is drawing on the work of all of those that we have heard about, more or less, to different extents, obviously, because it's probably more drawing on economics and sociology, on statistics. I think what's important though for the policy advisor, what the first thing here, it says whispers in the ear of the powerful, and I guess that's true. I would say in an optimal situation, that policy advisor, on the other hand, would at the same time listen to those that are not necessarily the most powerful ones, so that whatever is whispered in the ear of the powerful is also informed by different perspectives, by different voices, so that this becomes, in a way, a means to balance and to address some of those inequalities that are out there through policies. And yes, risk of ends justifying means. I think policy as such, it's linked obviously to government. It's obviously linked often to election cycles. It's often also dominated by more short-term considerations. It's more difficult to make more long-term policies attractive that are sometimes needed to achieve the equity that we're looking for. And I think it's a dynamic relationship between the state and the different members of the society that's constantly evolving, and that policy advisors in a way need to take into account and then see how that can shape new institutional arrangements and related policies. In the ocean space, for example, we have seen this explosion of developments and initiatives and policies around everything that's called like blue economy, blue growth, that has received a lot of attention. But at the same time now, for example, we're seeing a shift that this is gradually replaced, and there's more use of sustainable ocean governance to address some of the shortcomings that were in the early narratives that were associated with the blue economy, which had more of a narrow focus really on the economic sectors. And now there are new concepts coming up like blue justice. And all of this is in a way finding the attention also of policy advisors. And there's more of a recognition of the need to distribute the benefits from the ocean more equitably, because ultimately if that is not happening, then the environmental impacts, but also the social and the political stability will be harmed by that. And I think now there is this recognition that this policy blindness to equity issues needs to be addressed in order to really achieve a sustainable and just ocean economy. Maybe that's me being very hopeful, but in a way that is what also an institution like FAO, in a way that has a more kind of normative advisory role, is trying to do, to advise member countries, to provide policy guidance, policy advice as global public good in the interest of society as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Again, I don't feel like we're doing justice to these issues we're exploring, but I guess this was the perils of having a panel as you know, with 9 people on it and only an hour and a half. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because now we're going to watch a video from a visual artist, also in Peru, and he'll explain his work to us. So I've stopped sharing, so I'll hand over to James for that.
Soy Marco Carpio de Perú, artista. Yo crecí cerca al mar y el mar siempre ha sido una fuente de inspiración en mi trabajo. Yo creo desde la coexistencia con la naturaleza y de culturas integradas a ella. Por favor, permítanme mostrarles algo de mi trabajo.
Thank you so much, Marco, for sending us that video to include. I think it's really powerful and interesting, especially for me. I suppose that the other forms of knowledge in terms of creative knowledge is not something that I'm immediately considering in including in some of the work that I'm doing in relation to oceans governance. So I was just wondering, I mean, perhaps we could end here on a discussion in relation to that. I don't know if anyone here has any reflections. Otto.
Yeah, Marco's work is really, really, really interesting. I loved how it was almost like a lesson in anatomy as well as art, and bringing like raw elements from the sea into the community. And I guess the practice of creating an art form together with the community kind of promotes conversations. And I think that's the main purpose of art is to promote conversations and to help share different stories around that. And I just wanted to lead into like the role of, because I know Holly asked me to talk about the role of creatives or art in this like transdisciplinary approach and arena. And it's in the way that like living art promotes conversations in the real world. Most of us are living in this very digital space. And then I feel like films can help promote those kind of conversations and take the stories from the ocean and give them a platform to be shared in like a very digital space. Yeah,
I think it's a really interesting perspective, this idea, and I think Rose, perhaps, because I know Rose is also involved in, I think you introduced yourself as a poet, didn't you, Rose, in terms of
Sorry, I couldn't hear you very well there, Holly. Were you speaking to me?
Oh, yes, I was. Sorry, apologies. I was just wondering, because I know that you've shared some poetry with us privately while we've been on this event, and it's just really interesting to hear your perspectives on and how we engage with the creative knowledge in terms of.
Look, I mean, I think it's extraordinary. I mean, I've seen some fascinating things that creatives have been doing insofar as their engagement with and their knowledge of the sea is concerned. And what astonished me about that video was just the fact that he introduced another level to it. I like what Otto said, but I also think that it was also about the tactile, you know, because it's a mural. So in a sense, you know, if children go past that particular wall, over time, of course, the mural is going to fade out because people are going to want to touch it. I mean, that was one of the things that struck me about it, because often the knowledge that we have and the knowledge that we share, it is untouchable knowledge. It's knowledge that exists either in our minds or that which we share between ourselves as professionals, but it's a knowledge that is ephemeral and it is not always easily accessible to local community members. And by producing a mural and using that particular format, he introduces another level of the sensory, which is the tactile, which means that local communities can actually access it, and therefore will have a deeper sense, you know, of the beauty and complexity of that which lies beneath the sea.
It's I find it both tactile and then bringing the community element in, but I also find some of the imagery quite I suppose on first glance it's quite shocking in a way, because you see bone and iron and rust, but then you sort of start to understand that it's you know, you see the forms within that and what it's leading to, and yeah, it's just a beautiful way to explore the integration of different kinds of knowledge into the conversation, I suppose, and the dialogue, and more, really. So we have 6 minutes left, which doesn't leave us long, and we were going to hand over to Nicole to very briefly introduce some of the work of the FAO, where they've actually are applying transdisciplinary approach. So I don't know, Nicole, whether you have whether you have abbreviated version that you can use here, or whether really it's just it's beyond the it's not going to work in this case.
Yeah, it's might be a bit tricky, and I wonder if we want to better use the time to kind of continue, because I think this is really fascinating, and I think it's better use of our time to just keep this going. So yeah, lovely.
Okay, well, I really apologise for that. We've all just got too much to say, clearly. So I suppose if we could open the floor to any of the panelists here, to if anyone has any reflections on how we might bring all of us together onto the same page, and how we might, and what we feel transdisciplinarity provides us when we're working in this context. What does it mean for us? If people want to write me a note and I can read that out, or if anyone wants to jump on and sort of add something here, feel free.
Okay, so let me add something. I think that Payal's submission was very great. Adding on to what she said, I think the values underpinning transdisciplinarity is something that we must recognize and apply in our research. You know, here the values of respect, the values of acknowledging the fact that every discipline has a role to play, you know, in adding on to the existing set of knowledge, which a policymaker would be interested in creating an appropriate framework for a transformative, you know, society. You know, so I think that by and large we can as you know, academics, as researchers, as we move along with our research and appreciating the fact that transdisciplinarity is a right trajectory to apply. I think that respecting the elements of everyone's research as an anthropologist, as a social scientist, respecting law, respecting what a photographer would do, respecting what an artist would do, respecting what a poet would do, and respecting what a lawyer and a fishery scientist would do, you know, has its own way of opening up for people to share their ideas. You know, people will not feel limited when they are bringing up the ideas. So I think that this whole idea of appreciating and respecting discipline.
Yeah, so I just noticed that Jeremy's putting a question in the chat saying it'd be interesting to hear about the panel's experience of and how our views have changed on it. So the example that kind of came to mind for me was during one of our planning meetings for the One Ocean Hub project that we're kind of all here for. We were talking about some of our work in Ghana, and we'd realised we've got a bunch of fisheries scientists and ecologists, and we've got anthropologists like John. But there was a bit of a kind of gap in the middle where we needed some help, some extra expertise to try and sort of fill the breadth of what we were trying to do. And I thought I had a good idea of what that was. So I kind of convened a meeting and, you know, said, right, okay, this is the problem. And it turned out I was completely wrong. So I was kind of so far off base that we have finished the meeting by me going back to saying, okay, what's the right question to be asking? So in a weird way that feels like progress, but also, you know, no. So yeah, that's kind of like, even in the space of an hour, like just actually realizing that you probably are asking the right question to begin with is that was my answer to it. I don't know if anyone else.
Jump in, James. I mean, I've spoken a lot tonight, and but I think, and I didn't really want to, but I think this is for me. This started off, I suppose, as a discussion of a whole bunch of us talking about we need to sort of. It would be really interesting for us to get together to so we can understand more about where each other sits, where they're from, what knowledge they're producing, how and when you engage with each other. But then, as a friend also said to me, you know, if it's a transdisciplinary group, then you're most likely just get everyone talking at the same time and nobody listening to each other, and you don't know where you're going, and it's a total chaos. But actually, you know, I think what we've shown here is we can all talk in turn and we can all talk to the same points, but from our different perspectives. And for me, it's been an absolute pleasure spending time with all of you, kind of working out how we hold an event where each of our kind of knowledges and information sort of bases sit and as well as our interests, and yeah, it's been, I just thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope we can continue working together. So I think I don't know if anyone else has anything else to add on that point, but I think it's probably a good point to close and saying that seemingly transdisciplinarity is a great thing. It's opening the conversation and bringing new people into your sort of, I guess, vision and the way that you sort of perceive ocean governance and beyond. But thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So we were going to play a quick video to close.
Ndibalulekileyo into okokubana masinganxibi ibhlankasi, masingajongi apha phambi kwethu, masijonge efar apho siya kude apho siya khoyo. Iinjongo zethu into yobana kungapheli okanye kubhenefithe thina, makubhenefithe nesizukulwane.